Robert Williams stood on the front porch of his family home, watching the morning sun filter through the old oak trees that had shaded this property for over a century. At 72 years old, he had lived in this house his entire life, just like his father before him and his grandfather before that. The Victorian-style home on Maple Street wasn't just a building to Robert. It was a living piece of history that held the memories of 5 generations of his family. The house had been built in 1873 by his great-great-grandfather, Thomas Williams, who had been born into slavery but earned his freedom and worked as a skilled carpenter after the Civil War. Thomas had saved every penny for years, taking on extra jobs and working weekends, all with one dream in mind: to own a piece of land where his family could build a future. When he finally had enough money, he bought this corner lot and built the house with his own hands, using techniques that were meant to last for generations. Robert often thought about Thomas as he walked through the rooms. The hand-carved banister that Thomas had spent months perfecting still guided visitors up the wooden staircase. The original hardwood floors, though worn smooth by decades of footsteps, still gleamed when the afternoon light hit them just right. Every board, every nail, every carefully crafted detail told the story of a man who had refused to let his circumstances define his future. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over the years. When Robert was a child in the 1950s, Maple Street was filled with working-class families who had lived there for decades. Everyone knew everyone, and neighbors looked out for each other. Children played in the streets until the streetlights came on, and summer evenings were filled with the sounds of families gathering on front porches to escape the heat. But in recent years, everything had started to shift. Young professionals with good jobs had begun moving in, attracted by the neighborhood's proximity to downtown and its historic charm. Old houses were being renovated with modern touches, and property values had climbed steadily. Robert didn't mind the changes at first. In fact, he was happy to see the neighborhood improving and becoming safer. The problem started about 2 years ago when someone decided the neighborhood needed a homeowners association. Robert had lived on Maple Street for 7 decades without ever needing an HOA, but he understood that newer residents might want some organization to help maintain property values and keep the area looking nice. When the letters started arriving about forming the association, Robert figured it couldn't hurt to have some basic rules about keeping yards tidy and houses well maintained. The first HOA meeting was held at the community center, and Robert made sure to attend. He wanted to be a good neighbor and understand what the association planned to do. The meeting was run by Patricia Hoffman, a real estate agent who had moved to the neighborhood just 18 months earlier. She seemed friendly enough and talked about maintaining property values and creating a sense of community. Patricia explained that the HOA would handle basic things like making sure everyone kept their grass cut, their houses painted, and their driveways clean. She mentioned that there would be small monthly fees to cover administrative costs and maybe some neighborhood improvements like better street lighting or holiday decorations. It all sounded reasonable to Robert, so he signed up along with most of his neighbors. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. The HOA sent out friendly newsletters with reminders about upcoming community events and basic maintenance tips. Robert even contributed to a neighborhood cleanup day, where volunteers picked up litter and planted flowers in the small park at the end of the street. He was starting to think that maybe having an HOA wasn't such a bad idea after all, but then the letters started coming. The first one arrived on a Thursday morning in March. Robert was having his coffee and reading the newspaper when he heard the mail truck pull up. Among the usual bills and advertisements was an official-looking envelope with the HOA logo. Inside was a violation notice stating that his mailbox needed to be painted to match neighborhood standards. Robert walked outside and looked at his mailbox with confusion. It was the same black metal mailbox that had been there for at least 20 years. It wasn't rusty or damaged, just slightly faded from years of sun and weather. He looked up and down the street at his neighbors' mailboxes and noticed they were all different colors. Some black, some white, some even had decorative designs. He couldn't understand why his mailbox specifically had been singled out. The notice gave him 30 days to repaint the mailbox and included a $50 fine that would be added to his HOA account. Robert thought it was a bit harsh for such a minor issue, but he didn't want to cause trouble. The next weekend, he bought a can of black paint and spent a Saturday morning making his mailbox look brand new. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This time the HOA was complaining about his front gate. The wooden gate had been handcrafted by his grandfather in the 1920s and featured intricate carved details that reflected the craftsmanship of that era. The notice stated that the gate was inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics and needed to be replaced with something more uniform and modern. Robert stared at the letter in disbelief. This gate wasn't just a piece of wood to him, it was a work of art created by his grandfather's hands. It had weathered storms, welcomed family members home from wars, and watched children grow up and move away. The idea of replacing it with some generic store-bought gate felt like erasing a piece of his family's history. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting to discuss the matter. When he arrived at the community center, he noticed that the meeting time had been changed from evening to mid-afternoon on a weekday, making it difficult for people who worked regular jobs to attend. Only about 12 people were there, mostly retirees and people who worked from home. When Robert raised his hand to speak about the gate issue, Patricia listened politely but seemed dismissive of his concerns about the historical significance. She explained that the HOA's goal was to create a cohesive look throughout the neighborhood that would help maintain property values. She suggested that while his gate might have sentimental value, it wasn't in line with the modern image the association was trying to create. Robert left the meeting feeling frustrated and confused. He had always taken pride in maintaining his property, and he couldn't understand why features that had been part of the neighborhood for decades were suddenly being treated as problems. As he drove home, he noticed that several other houses had unique features: decorative shutters, vintage porch railings, old-style light fixtures, but none of those homeowners seemed to be getting violation notices. That night, Robert sat in his living room and looked through old photo albums filled with pictures of his family in and around the house. There was his father as a young man, standing proudly next to the gate his own father had built. There was Robert's wedding day, with his bride posing under the same carved archway. There were pictures of his children taking their first steps on the front porch, and later photos of his grandchildren playing in the same yard where he had played as a boy. The house wasn't just his home. It was a repository of memories, a testament to his family's journey from slavery to freedom to prosperity. Every creaking floorboard, every worn doorknob, every carefully preserved original feature told part of that story. The idea that someone who had lived in the neighborhood for less than 2 years could decide that his family's heritage didn't fit their vision of what the area should look like struck him as deeply unfair. As Robert prepared for bed that night, he made a decision. He would pay the fine for the mailbox to keep the peace, but he wasn't going to replace his grandfather's gate. Some things were more important than HOA rules, and preserving his family's history was one of them. He had no idea that this decision would lead to a battle that would change his life forever. 2 months after Robert's decision to keep his grandfather's gate, the letters from the HOA started arriving with alarming frequency. What had begun as a single complaint about his mailbox had somehow snowballed into a weekly barrage of violation notices, each one more nitpicky than the last. The first follow-up notice about the gate came with an increased fine of $200. Patricia Hoffman had written a personal note at the bottom, stating that the HOA board had voted unanimously to enforce neighborhood standards more strictly. Robert found this odd, since he remembered several board members at the original meeting expressing appreciation for the neighborhood's historic character. But it was the next violation notice that really caught Robert off guard. According to the HOA, his window shutters were now considered non-conforming architectural elements. These weren't modern, decorative shutters. They were the original, functional shutters that had been installed when the house was built in 1873. They were made of solid wood, painted in a deep green color that had been refreshed multiple times over the decades but always maintained in the same traditional style. Robert walked around his house, examining the shutters with new eyes. They were in excellent condition, properly maintained, and added to the historic charm that had attracted so many new residents to the neighborhood in the first place. He couldn't understand how features that had been part of the landscape for 150 years could suddenly be deemed inappropriate. The violation notice demanded that he replace all 12 sets of shutters with modern, uniform alternatives within 60 days or face escalating fines. The estimated cost for this replacement would be at least $3,000, money that Robert, living on a fixed retirement income, didn't have readily available. Determined to understand what was happening, Robert decided to do some detective work. He walked through the neighborhood one evening, carefully observing other houses and their features. What he discovered made his blood boil. Houses owned by newer residents had all sorts of non-conforming elements that apparently didn't warrant violation notices. The Johnson House 3 blocks over had bright blue shutters that were clearly modern reproductions, not original features. The Patterson family had installed decorative window boxes that protruded into the sidewalk area, which should have been a clear violation of HOA rules about encroaching on common spaces. The new development at the end of Maple Street had houses with vinyl siding designed to look like wood, which was definitely not in keeping with the neighborhood's authentic historic character. Yet none of these homeowners seemed to be receiving the constant stream of violation notices that had been flooding Robert's mailbox. He began to suspect that the enforcement of HOA rules was far from uniform, but he couldn't quite figure out the pattern yet. The situation escalated further when Robert received a notice about his front porch railing. The ornate ironwork had been installed by his father in the 1940s, replacing original wooden railings that had begun to deteriorate. The metalwork featured intricate scroll patterns and decorative elements that were typical of the era and added significant character to the house's facade. According to the new violation notice, the railing was too ornate and didn't match the clean, modern aesthetic the HOA was trying to establish. Robert was given 30 days to replace it with a simpler design or face a $500 fine. The cost of replacing the custom ironwork would be astronomical, and the idea of destroying his father's craftsmanship felt like vandalism. Robert decided it was time to take action. He requested copies of all HOA correspondence from the past year, which homeowners had a right to receive under state law. What he discovered in those documents was deeply troubling. The records showed that while he had received over a dozen violation notices in the past 6 months, most other homeowners had received none at all. Even more suspicious, several properties with obvious maintenance issues, peeling paint, overgrown yards, broken fence posts, had received only gentle reminders rather than formal violations with fines attached. The pattern became clearer when Robert cross-referenced the violation notices with property ownership records. The homeowners receiving the harshest treatment were predominantly longtime residents, particularly older residents who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Meanwhile, newer residents who had moved in within the past few years seemed to enjoy a much more lenient approach to rule enforcement. Robert also discovered that Patricia Hoffman's real estate business had been unusually active in the neighborhood. Her company had handled the sale of 6 properties on or near Maple Street in the past 18 months, often representing both buyers and sellers in transactions that seemed to happen very quickly. Several of these sales had occurred after elderly homeowners received multiple HOA violations and expressed frustration about the mounting fines. The most disturbing discovery was a series of emails between Patricia and other board members discussing property improvement strategies and encouraging turnover of non-compliant properties. While the language was carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, the implication was clear. The HOA was being used as a tool to pressure certain homeowners into selling. When Robert tried to attend the next HOA meeting to address these concerns, he found that the meeting location had been changed again. Instead of the community center, it was now being held in Patricia's real estate office, which had a much smaller conference room. The meeting time had also been moved to 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, making it nearly impossible for working people to attend. Only 8 people showed up to the meeting, and Robert quickly realized that most of them were either close friends of Patricia or people who had recently purchased homes through her real estate company. When he raised questions about the inconsistent enforcement of violations, Patricia dismissed his concerns as misunderstandings and suggested that he might be more comfortable in a neighborhood with less stringent standards. The veiled threat was clear, but Robert wasn't intimidated. He had been fighting for what was right his entire life, first as a young man during the civil rights movement and later as a high school principal who advocated for students who faced discrimination. He wasn't about to back down from someone who had been in the neighborhood for less than 2 years and was trying to erase the history that made it special. After the meeting, Robert decided to reach out to other longtime residents who might be facing similar problems. He started with his next-door neighbor, Dorothy Chen, an 80-year-old widow who had lived on Maple Street for 45 years. Dorothy confided that she had been receiving violation notices about her rose garden, which supposedly extended too far into the front yard setback area. The rose garden had been Dorothy's pride and joy for decades. She had planted it shortly after moving to the neighborhood, and it had become a landmark that people would drive by just to admire during blooming season. The roses were meticulously maintained and added tremendous beauty to the streetscape. But according to the HOA, they violated regulations about landscaping in the front yard. Robert learned that Dorothy had already spent over $1,000 trying to modify her garden to comply with the HOA's demands, but the violation notices kept coming. Each new complaint seemed to focus on increasingly minor details: the height of certain plants, the placement of decorative stones, the color of mulch used around the flower beds. As Robert talked to more neighbors, a disturbing picture emerged. The HOA was systematically targeting longtime residents with frivolous violations, while ignoring much more serious issues affecting properties owned by newer residents. The fees were mounting quickly, and several elderly homeowners were beginning to consider selling rather than continuing to fight what felt like an endless battle. The breaking point came when Robert received a violation notice about his house number. The brass numbers attached to his front door had been installed by his father in the 1950s and featured an elegant script font that was perfectly legible and in excellent condition. According to the HOA, these numbers didn't meet the new visibility standards and needed to be replaced with plain block numbers within 2 weeks. The fine for this violation was $100, bringing Robert's total HOA debt to over $800 for violations that would have cost thousands of dollars to remedy. He was beginning to understand that the goal wasn't really compliance. It was to create financial pressure that would force him to sell his family's historic home. That evening, Robert sat in his living room and made a decision that would change everything. He picked up the phone and called his nephew David, a civil rights attorney who worked for a law firm in the state capital. It was time to fight back, not just for himself, but for all the longtime residents who were being pushed out of the neighborhood they had called home for decades. As Robert explained the situation to David, he could hear the anger building in his nephew's voice. David had visited the house countless times growing up and understood the historical significance of every feature that the HOA was trying to eliminate. More importantly, as a lawyer specializing in housing discrimination cases, David recognized the tactics being used and knew they were likely illegal. The war for Robert's home was about to begin, and this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. The certified letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, exactly 8 months after Robert had received his first violation notice about the mailbox. He knew it was serious the moment he saw the thick envelope with the law firm's return address. His hands trembled slightly as he tore open the envelope and unfolded the official documents inside. The words hit him like a physical blow. Notice of Lien placement. The HOA was claiming that Robert owed $28,000 in unpaid fines, administrative fees, legal costs, and interest charges. They were placing a lien on his property, which meant he couldn't sell or refinance his home until the debt was paid in full. Even worse, if the debt remained unpaid, they could potentially force the sale of his house to recover the money. Robert sat down heavily in his kitchen chair and read through the documents again, trying to understand how $800 in violation fines had somehow ballooned into a debt that was larger than his annual retirement income. The breakdown was shocking. The original fines had been multiplied by penalty charges. Then administrative fees had been added for each letter sent, followed by legal fees for the lien process itself. Most disturbing of all was a line item labeled property assessment fees, totaling $12,000. This charge was supposedly for having a professional property management company evaluate his home's compliance with HOA standards. Robert had never faked such an assessment, never been told it was happening, and certainly never agreed to pay for it. The letter gave him 30 days to pay the full amount or face additional legal action. At the bottom of the final page, Patricia Hoffman had included a handwritten note. Mr. Williams, I hope you'll reconsider our previous discussions about helping you transition to a more suitable living situation. Please call me to discuss options. Robert's first instinct was to call David immediately, but he forced himself to calm down and think clearly. He needed to gather all the documentation he could find before involving his nephew. Over the next few hours, he pulled together every piece of correspondence he had received from the HOA, organized them chronologically, and created a timeline of events. As he worked through the papers, several things became clear. First, many of the fees and charges listed in the lien had never been mentioned in any previous correspondence. Second, the HOA had apparently hired Patricia's own property management company to conduct the assessment, creating an obvious conflict of interest. Third, the legal fees seemed grossly inflated for what should have been a simple administrative process. When Robert finally called David that evening, his nephew was furious. As a civil rights attorney, David had seen similar tactics used to push elderly homeowners and minority families out of gentrifying neighborhoods. The pattern was always the same: escalating violations, mounting fees, and eventually a lien that forced people to sell their homes at below-market prices. David asked Robert to scan and email all the documents so he could review them immediately. Within 2 hours, David called back with preliminary findings that were even more disturbing than Robert had imagined. "Uncle Robert, this isn't just harassment," David said, his voice tight with anger. "This is fraud. Half of these charges violate state laws governing HOA operations, and the property assessment was done without proper notification or homeowner consent. But there's something else you need to know." David had spent the evening researching Patricia Hoffman and her business activities in the neighborhood. What he discovered painted a picture of calculated predatory behavior that went far beyond simple HOA overreach. Patricia's real estate company had purchased 3 properties on Maple Street in the past year, all from elderly homeowners who had been facing similar HOA violation campaigns. In each case, the sellers had accepted offers that were significantly below market value, apparently desperate to escape the mounting legal fees and fines. Even more troubling, David's research revealed that Patricia had been making informal offers to purchase Robert's property for the past 6 months. She had approached him twice at community events, suggesting that maintaining such an old house must be becoming difficult at his age, and offering to help him find something more manageable while handling the sale of his current home. At the time, Robert had dismissed these conversations as friendly neighbor talk. Now he realized they were part of a deliberate strategy to acquire his property. Patricia had likely identified his corner lot, with its mature trees and proximity to the new light rail station, as particularly valuable for redevelopment. The most damning evidence came from David's review of public records related to Patricia's property management company. The business had been formed just 2 years ago, shortly after Patricia moved to the neighborhood, and its primary activity seemed to be conducting property assessments for HOA violations. The company had no other clients outside of the Maple Street area, suggesting it existed solely to generate inflated fees for HOA enforcement actions. David explained that this type of scheme was becoming more common in gentrifying neighborhoods across the country. Real estate speculators would get themselves elected to HOA boards, then use violation enforcement as a weapon to pressure longtime residents into selling their homes at below-market prices. The practice was illegal under both state consumer protection laws and federal fair housing regulations. "We're going to fight this," David told Robert, "and we're going to win. But I need you to understand that this is going to get ugly before it gets better. Patricia has been planning this for months, and she's not going to back down easily." The next morning, David filed an emergency motion in federal court to block the lien and freeze all HOA enforcement actions against Robert's property. He also sent a formal demand letter to Patricia and the HOA board, outlining the legal violations and demanding that all charges be dropped immediately. Patricia's response came within hours, and it revealed just how desperate she had become. Instead of backing down, she doubled down on the violations and added new charges for failure to cooperate with HOA proceedings and frivolous legal challenges to legitimate enforcement actions. But Patricia had made a critical mistake in her rush to escalate the situation. The new charges were so obviously retaliatory that they provided David with clear evidence of discriminatory intent. Under federal fair housing laws, this type of retaliation against a homeowner for asserting their legal rights was a serious violation that could result in significant monetary damages. David immediately expanded his legal filing to include claims for housing discrimination, predatory lending practices, and conspiracy to deprive Robert of his property rights. He also requested a full investigation into Patricia's business activities and her role in other property transactions in the neighborhood. The case began attracting attention from local civil rights organizations and housing advocacy groups. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund offered to provide additional legal support, recognizing that Robert's case represented a broader pattern of discrimination that was affecting elderly, homeowners, and longtime residents throughout the city. Local news stations picked up the story after David issued a press release highlighting the historical significance of Robert's home and the suspicious timing of the HOA's enforcement actions. The coverage was devastating for Patricia's reputation, as reporters uncovered additional instances of questionable HOA practices and conflicts of interest. One particularly damaging news report featured interviews with 3 other elderly homeowners who had been forced to sell their homes after facing similar HOA harassment. In each case, Patricia's real estate company had been involved in the eventual sale, and the new owners had immediately received permission to make modifications that had previously been denied to the original homeowners. As the media attention intensified, other residents began coming forward with their own stories of selective enforcement and intimidation tactics. A pattern emerged of the HOA targeting properties that were particularly valuable for redevelopment while ignoring violations on less desirable lots. The tipping point came when a local newspaper published a series of emails between Patricia and her business partner that had been obtained through a public records request. The emails discussed specific properties they hoped to acquire and strategies for encouraging difficult homeowners to consider other options. One email specifically mentioned Robert's property, describing it as the prize corner lot and outlining plans to increase pressure through consistent enforcement until the homeowner sees reason and accepts our assistance in relocating. When confronted with this evidence, several HOA board members resigned in disgust, claiming they had been misled about the purpose and scope of the violation enforcement campaign. 2 board members admitted that Patricia had assured them the violations were necessary to maintain property values, without mentioning her financial interest in acquiring the properties involved. The scandal had grown beyond a simple dispute between Robert and his HOA. It had become a case study in how unscrupulous individuals could manipulate homeowners' associations to serve their own financial interests while destroying the very communities they claimed to be protecting. As Robert read the latest newspaper coverage of his case, he felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. He was glad that the truth was finally coming out, but he was heartbroken that his peaceful neighborhood had been turned into a battleground by someone's greed. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, Robert felt hopeful that justice would prevail. His family's 150-year legacy was worth fighting for, and he was determined to ensure that future generations would be able to call the house on Maple Street their home. Judge Catherine Morrison took exactly 3 days to reach her decision, though for Robert Williams, those 3 days felt like the longest of his life. He spent the time quietly at home, tending to his grandmother's garden and trying to stay calm while the weight of 150 years of family history hung in the balance. On Friday morning, December 1st, the courtroom was even more packed than it had been during the trial. Word had spread throughout the community that the judge was ready to announce her ruling, and people had driven from across the state to witness what many hoped would be a landmark decision in the fight against housing discrimination. Robert sat in the front row next to David, wearing the same navy blue suit he had worn to church every Sunday for the past 15 years. Behind them, the gallery was filled with neighbors, civil rights advocates, reporters, and community members who had been following the case since it began. Dorothy Chen sat in the second row, her hands folded in prayer. The pastor from Mount Olive Baptist Church had come to offer moral support, along with dozens of congregation members who had been praying for Robert throughout the ordeal. Patricia Hoffman looked pale and nervous as she sat with her legal team. The past month had been devastating for her personally and professionally. Her real estate license was under review by the state commission. Several former clients had filed complaints alleging fraud and misrepresentation, and her property management company had lost all of its remaining clients once the details of the case became public. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom with a thick folder of documents and a stern expression that gave no hint of her decision. The room fell completely silent as she took her seat and organized her papers. The tension was so thick that Robert could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. In the matter of Williams versus Maple Street Homeowners Association and Patricia Hoffman, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the packed courtroom. This court has carefully reviewed all evidence, testimony, and legal arguments presented by both parties. She paused to look directly at Robert, then at Patricia, before continuing. The evidence in this case reveals a systematic campaign of harassment, fraud, and discrimination that strikes at the heart of American values of fairness, equality, and respect for property rights. The defendant, Patricia Hoffman, used her position as HOA board president to orchestrate a scheme designed to force longtime residents from their homes through fraudulent violation notices, inflated fees, and predatory enforcement practices. Robert felt David squeeze his shoulder as the judge continued her ruling. The court finds that Ms. Hoffman violated multiple state and federal laws, including the Fair Housing Act, state consumer protection statutes, and regulations governing homeowners association operations. The evidence clearly shows that enforcement actions were targeted based on the age and race of property owners, with the specific intent of forcing sales that would benefit the defendant's real estate business. Judge Morrison's voice grew stronger as she outlined the specific violations. The $28,000 lien placed against Mr. Williams's property was fraudulent and is hereby declared null and void. The court further finds that the property assessment conducted by Ms. Hoffman's company was done without proper authorization and was designed solely to generate inflated fees. All charges and fines assessed against Mr. Williams are dismissed with prejudice. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as neighbors hugged each other and reporters scribbled notes. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. This court awards Mr. Williams compensatory damages in the amount of $150,000 for the emotional distress, legal fees, and violation of his civil rights. Additionally, the court awards punitive damages of $300,000, designed to send a clear message that this type of predatory behavior will not be tolerated in our communities. Robert felt tears streaming down his face as the full weight of the decision hit him. Not only had he won, but the judge had awarded him enough money to ensure that his family's home would be secure for generations to come. But Judge Morrison still wasn't done. Furthermore, this court hereby issues a permanent injunction barring Patricia Hoffman from serving on any homeowners association board within this state. Her real estate license will be suspended pending a full investigation by the state commission, and her property management company is banned from conducting business in this county for a period of 10 years. The judge's final words were directed specifically at Patricia, whose face had gone white as the severity of the ruling became clear. Ms. Hoffman, your actions in this case represent a betrayal of the trust placed in you by your neighbors, and a violation of the most basic principles of fair dealing. You used your position of authority to prey upon vulnerable homeowners, and you attempted to steal not just property, but the legacy and history that give our communities their character and meaning. As court was dismissed, Robert was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Dorothy Chen was crying tears of joy, knowing that her own situation would now be resolved. The other homeowners who had been targeted by Patricia's schemes were already planning to file their own legal actions. Knowing that Robert's victory had established a strong precedent, the media response to the ruling was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, news of the decision was being reported on national television and in newspapers across the country. Civil rights organizations hailed it as a landmark victory that would help protect vulnerable homeowners from similar predatory schemes. Legal experts praised Judge Morrison's thorough ruling and the substantial damages award, noting that it would likely deter other real estate speculators from attempting similar schemes. Law schools began adding the case to their curricula as an example of effective civil rights litigation. The impact extended far beyond Robert's individual case. Within 6 months of the ruling, 3 states had passed new laws strengthening oversight of HOA operations and establishing clear procedures for homeowners to appeal violation notices. The Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development launched a nationwide investigation into discriminatory HOA practices, using Robert's case as a model for identifying similar violations. Most importantly for Robert, the victory meant that his family's 150-year legacy was secure. The settlement money allowed him to establish a trust that would maintain the property in perpetuity, ensuring that future generations of his family would always have a connection to their ancestral home. 6 months after the court ruling, Robert received an unexpected visitor. A representative from the State Historical Society came to inform him that his house was being designated as an official historical landmark. The designation not only provided additional legal protection for the property's historic features, but also included a bronze plaque that would tell the story of the Williams family and their contribution to the community's heritage. The day the plaque was installed, the entire neighborhood turned out for the dedication ceremony. Even some of the newer residents who had initially supported the HOA's aggressive enforcement acknowledged that they had been misled about the true purpose of the violation campaign. Dorothy Chen's rose garden was also granted historical protection, ensuring that her late husband's memory would continue to bloom every spring for generations to come. Several other historic features throughout the neighborhood received similar designations, creating a protected zone that celebrated the area's authentic character while welcoming appropriate modern improvements. Patricia Hoffman eventually left the state after losing her real estate license and declaring bankruptcy. When faced with multiple lawsuits from other homeowners she had targeted, her property management company was dissolved, and the properties she had acquired through her fraudulent schemes were sold to pay restitution to her victims. Robert used part of his settlement money to establish the Williams Family Legal Defense Fund, which provides free legal assistance to elderly homeowners and people of color who face discriminatory HOA enforcement. The fund has already helped dozens of families fight back against predatory practices and has prevented countless others from losing their homes to similar schemes. On quiet evenings, Robert still sits on his front porch, watching the sunset filter through the oak trees that have shaded his family's property for over a century. The hand-carved gate created by his grandfather still welcomes visitors. The original shutters still frame the windows that have watched over Maple Street for 150 years, and the ornate railing crafted by his father still guides people up the front steps. But now there's something new. The bronze historical marker that tells the story of the Williams family and their journey from slavery to freedom to prosperity. School children often stop to read the plaque and learn about the importance of preserving history and fighting for what's right. Robert's victory became more than just a personal triumph. It became a symbol of resistance against those who would use their power to prey upon the vulnerable, and a reminder that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to give up in the face of injustice. That the house on Maple Street stands today as it has for 150 years, a testament to the enduring power of family, community, and the American dream. And thanks to Robert Williams's courage to fight back against those who tried to steal his legacy, it will continue to stand for generations to come, protected not just by law, but by the love and determination of a family that refused to let their history be erased.